The clock tower loomed over Belhaven like a forgotten sentinel, its weathered stone facade casting long shadows across the crumbling remnants of the ghost town. I had seen photos of the place in the job listing, but no picture could prepare me for the eerie grandeur of seeing it in person. They said it was a simple caretaker position: keep the clock running, maintain the tower, and ensure everything stayed in working order. The pay was generous, the kind of money that didn't usually come with a job requiring so little effort. I couldn't believe my luck. When I told my friends I'd taken a job in the middle of nowhere, maintaining a clock tower in an abandoned town, they thought I was insane. Maybe I was, but after years of grinding through office jobs that sucked the life out of me, the idea of solitude in the open wilderness felt like salvation. Besides, how hard could it be to keep a clock running? A bit of oil here, a bit of tightening there, and I'd have the rest of my time to myself. Time, I chuckled at the irony, was something I finally thought I'd have plenty of. As my car rolled into Belhaven, the ghost town's dilapidated structures came into view, their warped wood and sagging roofs making them look like weary soldiers at attention. The town was eerily silent, the kind of silence that pressed down on you, making you hyper-aware of your own breath. A cold wind swept through the street, carrying the faint scent of metal and decay. I parked at the base of the tower and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots sounding unnaturally loud. The tower itself was both beautiful and unsettling, standing tall against a backdrop of dense, gray clouds. The massive clock face stared down at me, its iron hands pointing to an arbitrary time that seemed wrong for the overcast afternoon. The stones of the tower were mottled with ivy, and the wooden door at its base looked ancient, its surface marred with scratches that didn't seem entirely random. I hesitated before pushing it open, the old hinges groaning in protest as I stepped inside. The air within was colder, tinged with a metallic tang. The interior was a mix of crumbling stone and outdated machinery, gears and levers as big as I was resting in place like slumbering giants. A narrow, spiraling staircase led upward, its iron railings rusted and thin. Just beneath the stairs, tucked into a small alcove, was a door that led to the caretaker's quarters, my new home. I was surprised to find it somewhat cozy. The small room had a narrow cot, a battered wooden desk, and a fireplace that looked functional if old. A few shelves lined the walls, crammed with books, tools, and dusty knickknacks. On the desk sat a lantern, a stack of yellowed papers, and a brass key that glinted faintly in the dim light. A single window looked out onto the ghost town, offering a view of broken buildings and overgrown paths. A sharp knock at the open door startled me, and I turned to see an older man standing there. He had the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors, his face lined with creases that told of years spent frowning in the sun. "You Harper?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yes, that's me," I said, extending a hand. He didn't take it. "I'm Adler. Used to work this place before you. Just came to show you the ropes." He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room as if he expected something to leap out of the shadows. "You'll want to keep this place clean, especially up top. The clock's an old beast, but she'll run fine if you treat her right." Adler's tour was quick and perfunctory. He showed me the mechanism room at the top of the tower, where the clock's massive gears and pendulum hung in intricate, rusting precision. He rattled off basic instructions: oil this, tighten that, and handed me a schedule for regular maintenance. Then, without ceremony, he handed me the brass key from the desk. "Last thing," he said, his tone dropping. "There's rules. They're in the desk drawer. Read them. Follow them. Don't get clever." "What kind of rules?" I asked, trying to hide my amusement. "What, like don't spill coffee on the gears?" Adler didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. "You'll see. Just take them seriously. You'll thank me later." With that, he turned and left, his boots echoing on the staircase as he descended. I watched him go, half expecting him to slam the door on his way out, but he didn't. After a quick dinner of canned soup, I sat down at the desk and opened the drawer Adler had mentioned. Inside was a piece of parchment, its edges frayed with age. The handwriting was elegant and deliberate, as though each letter had been carved rather than written. The first rule was simple enough: The clock must always show the time of 3:15 a.m., no exceptions. I read the rest of the list, my amusement fading with each passing rule. Some were bizarre, others downright ominous. I tried to tell myself it was a joke, an initiation ritual for new caretakers. Still, something about the phrasing, direct and humorless, made me uneasy. Rule number 2. If the pendulum stops swinging, restart it immediately, but do not look at your reflection in the clock face. Rule number 3. Never wind the clock between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. Rule number 4. If you hear footsteps on the stairs but see no one, lock the room and wait until the sound stops. Rule number 5. Do not light the lanterns after midnight. Rule number 6. If the bells ring at any time other than 3:15 a.m., cover your ears and recite the phrase, "Time stands still for those who listen." Rule number 7. Do not allow birds to enter the tower. If one gets inside, catch it and release it immediately, alive. As I read the final rule, the lantern flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. I closed the drawer, set the parchment back in place, and told myself I was imagining things. Rule number 8. If you see the shadow of a man at the base of the tower, do not leave the clock room until sunrise. At the bottom of the list, a final warning read, "Follow the rules, and the clock will protect you. Break them, and time itself will unravel." I couldn't help but laugh. The idea that a clock needed rules felt absurd. Still, there was something about the handwriting and the precise language that unsettled me. Shaking off the unease, I climbed the narrow staircase into the clock room. Tomorrow, I would begin my new job. It was just a clock, after all. What could go wrong? That first night in the clock tower was everything I had imagined when I accepted the job: quiet, serene, and uneventful. The rhythmic ticking of the massive gears above created a soothing backdrop as I settled into bed. The occasional creak of the old wooden beams didn't bother me. It felt like the tower itself was alive, a living relic of history. I fell asleep easily, lulled by the tower's presence, thinking the rules were nothing more than an old caretaker's prank. But as the sun rose the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The first task on my schedule was to adjust the clock to the required time, 3:15 a.m. I climbed the narrow staircase to the top of the tower, each step groaning under my weight. The air grew colder as I ascended, and by the time I reached the mechanism room, I could see my breath. The room was massive, dominated by the clock's intricate inner workings. Gears the size of car tires interlocked with smaller, faster-spinning cogs, all driven by a pendulum that swung with deliberate precision. Sunlight streamed through the cracked glass of the clock face, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. I checked the clock face outside. It was showing 2:47, off by nearly half an hour. Following the instructions Adler had given me, I carefully adjusted the mechanism until the hands clicked into place at exactly 3:15. The clock gave a low groan of protest, as if it resented being manipulated, but the gears settled into a smooth rhythm. I stepped back, admiring my work. It was just a simple adjustment, yet it felt strangely significant, like I'd done more than just set the time. The room seemed to exhale, the ticking softening to a steady, even cadence. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I explored the town a bit, walking through the overgrown streets and peeking into the abandoned buildings. Most of them were too decrepit to enter safely, their roofs caved in and their walls crumbling. One structure caught my eye, a church with its steeple leaning precariously to one side. Its doors were chained shut, but a faded sign above the entrance read, "St. Augustine's." I wondered if the people of Belhaven had once prayed here before the disaster turned this place into a ghost town. The thought made me uneasy, and I quickly moved on. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I returned to the tower, locking the heavy wooden door behind me. The rules hadn't crossed my mind all day, but now, as darkness enveloped the town, they seemed to loom over me like a shadow. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Rules about not lighting lanterns after midnight or avoiding mirrors were clearly superstitions meant to spook the gullible. Still, I couldn't forget Adler's warning or the serious look in his eyes when he'd handed me the key. That night, at precisely 1 a.m., I decided to test one of the rules. The parchment had instructed me to close my eyes for exactly 1 minute at that time. It seemed harmless enough. If anything, it was probably meant to give the caretaker a moment to rest. Sitting in the caretaker's quarters, I set an alarm on my phone for 1 minute and waited until the clock struck 1 o'clock. When it did, I closed my eyes and started counting. The first few seconds were uneventful, and I felt a bit silly for taking it so seriously. But then, around the 20-second mark, I heard a faint sound. It was a soft scraping, like something being dragged across the floor above me. I froze, my heart racing. The noise grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it wasn't just above me, it was moving down the staircase. My instinct screamed at me to open my eyes, but I gritted my teeth and kept them shut, counting as steadily as I could. The scraping stopped just outside my door. The air grew icy, and I could hear my own ragged breathing as I struggled to keep calm. A new sound joined the silence, a faint tapping, like fingernails brushing against wood. The door creaked slightly, as though something was testing the handle. My phone alarm finally went off, and I opened my eyes with a gasp. The room was exactly as I'd left it, the door securely closed, but the tension in the air lingered. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what had happened. It had to be the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone in a creaky old tower in the middle of nowhere. Of course, I'd hear strange noises. Still, I couldn't explain the icy chill that had filled the room or the overwhelming sense of being watched. Determined to distract myself, I threw myself into maintenance work. The clock mechanism needed cleaning, and I spent hours polishing the gears and oiling the moving parts. It was satisfying work, and for a while, I forgot about the events of the previous night. But as I wiped down the clock face, I noticed something odd, a faint smudge in the shape of a handprint. It was on the inside of the glass, too large to be mine and placed at an angle that didn't make sense. I wiped it away quickly, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. That night, as I prepared for bed, I heard footsteps on the stairs. They were soft at first, almost hesitant, but they grew louder, more deliberate. I froze, my mind racing through the rules. Rule number 4. If you hear footsteps on the stairs but see no one, lock the room and wait until the sound stops. My hands trembled as I turned the key in the lock, securing the door. The footsteps reached the landing outside my room and stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then, slowly, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. When I finally unlocked the door, the staircase was empty, but I found something that hadn't been there before: faint, child-sized footprints in the dust, leading both up and down the stairs. The next morning, I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. I had followed the rules exactly as written, yet the footsteps and the child-sized prints haunted me. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe animals were nesting in the tower, or perhaps some prankster had snuck in and was trying to spook me. I decided that keeping busy was the best way to clear my mind, so after breakfast, I ventured out to explore Belhaven more thoroughly. The town felt like a snapshot of another era, frozen in decay. The dusty streets were littered with broken bottles, rusted tools, and scraps of fabric clinging to sagging wooden storefronts. Most of the buildings were boarded up, but I peered into a few that had their doors ajar. Inside, I found furniture covered in sheets of dust, overturned chairs, and evidence of a hurried exodus, abandoned clothes, empty trunks, and even a child's wooden toy left lying in the corner of a house. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race, and more than once, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. It was likely just the play of light through cracked windows, but it didn't stop me from feeling like I was being watched. One building in particular drew me in, the town library. Its arched windows were grimy with age, and the front door hung on its hinges, barely clinging to the frame. Inside, shelves sagged under the weight of decaying books. Most were too damaged to read, but I found a few intact volumes in the back room, including a thick ledger that seemed to document the town's mining operations. Flipping through it, I discovered entries about the mine's productivity, employee records, and finally, mentions of the disaster that had led to Belhaven's abandonment. The final entries in the ledger were chilling. On the day of the explosion, Several miners had refused to enter the shafts, claiming they'd heard whispers in the darkness and seen strange figures moving in the tunnels. The foreman dismissed their fears, threatening to dock their pay if they didn't work. Hours later, the explosion tore through the mine, killing 40 workers and leveling part of the town. According to the notes, the survivors described a sound that accompanied the blast, a low, resonant chime, like a bell ringing. The detail sent a chill down my spine, reminding me of rule number 6. If the bells ring at any time other than 3:15 a.m., cover your ears and recite the phrase. I closed the ledger and returned it to its shelf, feeling a newfound weight to my role as the clock's caretaker. Something about the disaster and the clock felt connected, though I couldn't yet piece together how. Before leaving the library, I found a journal tucked into a drawer of the librarian's desk. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was neat and legible. The entries were written by someone named Samuel Delaney, the town's first clock caretaker. As I skimmed through, certain lines leapt out at me. The clock is more than a machine. It listens. It waits. Time bends in this place. I swear I saw the hands move backward when I wasn't looking. The bells rang again last night. I covered my ears, but the sound still reached me. It doesn't just echo, it burrows into your thoughts. The journal ended abruptly with a single chilling sentence: "It won't let me leave." I returned to the clock tower that afternoon, the weight of what I'd read pressing down on me. The rules no longer felt like quirky superstitions. They were safeguards, a thin barrier between me and something far darker. My curiosity was battling with my growing fear, but I resolved to stay cautious. I hadn't broken any rules yet, and I intended to keep it that way. That night, as I made my rounds in the tower, I noticed a new problem. The pendulum was swinging erratically, its motion uneven and sluggish. Rule number 2 immediately came to mind. If the pendulum stops swinging, restart it immediately, but do not look at your reflection in the clock face. I climbed to the top of the tower, my flashlight beam slicing through the gloom, and found the pendulum nearly at a standstill. I reached for the lever to restart it, careful to keep my eyes focused on the mechanism rather than the glass face of the clock. As I pulled the lever, the clock groaned to life, its gears grinding together with renewed vigor. For a split second, my gaze flicked to the clock face, and I froze. My reflection was there, but it wasn't moving in sync with me. It smiled, a wide, unnatural grin, before vanishing entirely. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the stairs. The room was empty, but the air felt heavy, as though something unseen was watching. I hurried back to the caretaker's quarters, locking the door behind me. Sleep was out of the question. The next morning, I discovered another unnerving detail: a dead bird lying at the base of the clock tower's staircase. It was small and fragile, its feathers ruffled and its eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Rule number 7 flashed through my mind: do not allow birds to enter the tower. If one gets inside, catch it and release it immediately, alive. But I hadn't seen the bird enter, and now it was too late. I carefully picked it up with a cloth and carried it outside, burying it near the edge of the town. As I stood over the small mound of dirt, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, as though I'd made a mistake. That night, the clock's bells rang at 2:30 a.m. The sound jolted me awake, each chime reverberating through the walls of the tower. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to remember rule number 6: cover your ears and recite the phrase. I clamped my hands over my ears and muttered the words over and over. Time stands still for those who listen. The bells eventually stopped, but the silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I sat in the darkness, too afraid to move. When dawn finally broke, I felt like I'd survived a trial. The rules were no longer just guidelines, they were a lifeline. Whatever force was tied to this place, it wasn't interested in me breaking free. It wanted me to stay, to keep the clock running, and to follow its strange rituals without question. The following day, I awoke to a strange stillness in the air. The faint ticking of the clock usually echoed softly in the background, a constant reminder of my responsibilities. But today, there was silence. My first thought was panic. Had the pendulum stopped again? I scrambled to get dressed and rushed up the winding stairs to the top of the tower, my flashlight flickering as I moved. The climb felt longer than usual, each step reverberating unnaturally in the confined space. When I reached the clock room, the pendulum was swinging as it should, its rhythm steady and deliberate. I breathed a sigh of relief, but something felt off. The gears turned smoothly, but the air in the room felt heavier than usual, thick and oppressive. The silence I'd noticed earlier seemed to cling to the walls, an unnatural void that swallowed even the smallest sounds. I tried to shake off the unease, attributing it to lack of sleep and the lingering effects of the bells from the night before. After ensuring everything was in order with the clock, I descended back to the caretaker's quarters. My plan was to keep myself busy for the day, tidying up, taking notes on the clock's maintenance schedule, and reading through some of the books I'd brought with me. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, my thoughts kept drifting back to the rules, particularly rule number 8. If you see the shadow of a man at the base of the tower, do not leave the clock room until sunrise. I'd been careful to follow every rule so far, but the idea of seeing something outside, something waiting for me, filled me with dread. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the ghost town in an eerie twilight, I made my rounds. Everything seemed normal by Belhaven standards, anyway. The ticking of the clock provided a strange comfort, a steady rhythm that grounded me amidst the oddities of the town. But as midnight approached, the sense of unease began to grow again. The lanterns in the tower flickered, their flames dancing erratically even though there was no wind. I didn't light them after midnight, just as the rules instructed, but the dim glow they cast only made the shadows seem more alive. At 1 a.m., I closed my eyes for a minute, as rule number 1 required. The silence during that minute felt deeper than usual, pressing against my ears like cotton. When I opened my eyes, I glanced at the monitors and froze. One of the cameras, positioned to overlook the town square, showed movement. A shadow flitted across the screen, too quick and indistinct to identify. My stomach churned. I'd seen shadows move before, but this was different. It wasn't just a trick of the light. Something was out there. I reminded myself of rule number 4. If you hear footsteps on the stairs but see no one, lock the room and wait until the sound stops. I hadn't heard any footsteps yet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I would. I spent the next hour staring at the monitors, the static on the feeds growing louder and more persistent, like a subtle warning. At 2 a.m., I forced myself to look away, deciding to focus on the clock itself. Its hands pointed resolutely to 3:15 a.m., as they always should. But then, a low creak echoed through the tower, followed by the faint sound of footsteps on the stairs. My blood ran cold. They weren't hurried steps, more like a deliberate, steady ascent, each step placed with intent. My hands trembled as I locked the door to the clock room, following rule number 4. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. I could hear faint breathing on the other side, shallow and raspy, but I refused to look. Minutes felt like hours as I sat motionless, waiting for the sound to disappear. Finally, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps receded. I didn't move until I was certain they were gone, my body rigid with tension. When I finally unlocked the door and stepped out, the staircase was empty. I descended carefully, my flashlight casting long, wavering beams of light. At the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something new, a set of muddy footprints leading from the entrance of the tower to the staircase and back again. My heart pounded. I'd been alone in the tower all night, or so I thought. The next day, I decided to confront my growing fear by reading more of Samuel Delaney's journal. His words had been cryptic and unnerving before, but now they felt like the only lifeline to understanding what was happening. I pored over his descriptions of the clock, the rules, and the strange occurrences he'd experienced. One entry caught my attention. The shadow waits for those who falter. It feeds on hesitation, on fear. The rules are not merely precautions, they are a contract. Break them, and you become part of the clock's rhythm, a gear in its endless machine. The words made my skin crawl. Was I simply a caretaker, or was I part of something larger, something I didn't yet understand? The journal hinted at a connection between the clock and the town, but the details were frustratingly vague. It was clear that Delaney had grown more paranoid as time went on, his writing becoming fragmented and frantic. The final pages were filled with nonsensical diagrams of clock faces, scribbled over with phrases like, "The bells never stop," and "Time isn't linear here." That night, the tension in the tower reached a breaking point. The pendulum stopped swinging again, and as I restarted it, I caught another glimpse of my reflection in the clock face. This time, it didn't just smile, it raised a hand and pointed toward the staircase. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and refused to look at the glass again. Later, at precisely 3:15 a.m., the bells chimed once, their sound reverberating through the tower with an almost physical force. It wasn't the ominous, mistimed ringing from before, it was the correct time. But the sound felt different, almost alive. I covered my ears, even though I knew the rule didn't apply this time, and waited for the chimes to end. When the sun rose the next morning, I felt as though I'd barely survived. The rules had protected me, but just barely. It was becoming clear that whatever force inhabited the tower wasn't content to leave me alone, it was testing me, waiting for me to slip up. The following night began with an air of apprehension, the sort of feeling that wraps itself around your chest and refuses to let go. The tower seemed more alive than usual, creaking and groaning with every slight gust of wind. I spent the evening triple-checking the clock's mechanisms, ensuring everything was in perfect working order. The pendulum swung steadily, and the hands rested precisely at 3:15 a.m., as they should. Yet, the sense of foreboding was inescapable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for a moment of weakness. As midnight approached, I tried to distract myself by reading more of Samuel Delaney's journal. One entry stood out, written in a shaky hand, the ink smudged as if it had been written in haste. "The pendulum is the heart, the bells are the voice, and the shadow is the soul. Without one, the others falter. Never let them falter." The words left me with more questions than answers, but they resonated with an unsettling truth. The clock wasn't just a machine, it was something far more complex and dangerous. Delaney's warnings now felt less like the ramblings of a paranoid man and more like a lifeline to survival. The first unusual event of the night occurred shortly after 1 a.m. I was sitting in the clock room, staring at the monitors, when I noticed something moving in the town square. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but then I saw it, a figure, shrouded in darkness, standing motionless near the edge of the cemetery. It wasn't the shadow from rule number 8, but it was something equally unsettling. Its presence sent a shiver down my spine, and I quickly turned away from the monitor, unwilling to let it see me watching. When I glanced back moments later, the figure was gone. Not long after, I heard the familiar sound of footsteps on the stairs. They were deliberate and heavy, echoing through the tower like a metronome counting down to some inevitable event. I froze, my mind racing through the rules. Rule number 4. If you hear footsteps on the stairs but see no one, lock the room and wait until the sound stops. I stood up and locked the door, my hands trembling. The footsteps grew louder, each step punctuated by a low creak of the wooden stairs. They stopped just outside the door, and for a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears. Then, something new happened. A faint tapping sound began, rhythmic and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was knocking lightly on the door. It wasn't loud, but it carried an intensity that made my skin crawl. I gripped the edge of the desk, forcing myself to stay still and silent. After what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped, and the footsteps retreated. When I finally unlocked the door and stepped out, the staircase was empty, but there was a new addition to the walls, deep gouges, as though claws had raked across the wood. I tried to shake off the encounter, focusing on my duties, but the night wasn't finished with me yet. At around 2:30 a.m., I heard the unmistakable chime of the bells. My stomach dropped. The rules were clear, the bells should only ring at 3:15 a.m. I covered my ears immediately and began reciting the phrase from rule number 6, "Time stands still for those who listen." The words felt foreign in my mouth, almost as though they weren't meant for human speech. As I repeated the phrase, the chimes grew louder, reverberating through the tower with a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. When the ringing finally stopped, the silence that followed was deafening. I lowered my hands and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. That's when I noticed it, the pendulum had stopped. My blood ran cold. Rule number 2. If the pendulum stops swinging, restart it immediately, but do not look at your reflection in the clock face. I approached the pendulum cautiously, my hands trembling as I reached out to restart its motion. The air around me felt heavy, almost suffocating, as though the tower itself was holding its breath. As I pushed the pendulum to restart its swing, I caught a glimpse of the clock face out of the corner of my eye. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't my reflection. Its eyes were darker, its expression twisted into a sinister grin. I quickly looked away, my heart pounding in my chest. The rest of the night passed in a blur of tension and paranoia. The shadow from rule number 8 appeared near the base of the tower shortly after 3 a.m. It was larger than before, its outline flickering like a flame struggling against the wind. I locked myself in the clock room, refusing to look directly at it, and waited for sunrise. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. When dawn finally broke, the shadow vanished, leaving me exhausted but relieved to have survived. That morning, I noticed something strange. The clock's hands, which I had meticulously set to 3:15 a.m. the night before, had shifted slightly. It was a barely noticeable change, just a fraction of a degree, but it was enough to unsettle me. The clock wasn't just a machine, I realized. It was alive, and it was changing. As I prepared for another day, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could keep this up. The rules had kept me alive so far, but the tower seemed determined to test me, to push me to the edge of my endurance. The line between following the rules and falling into madness was growing thinner by the day. The next night began like all the others, but there was a heaviness in the air that made it hard to breathe. The rules had always been strict, but the tower itself now felt as if it was testing the very limits of my sanity. I had spent the day trying to rest, but my dreams were plagued by the sound of the bells, each chime pulling me deeper into an endless void. When I awoke, the sense of unease lingered, wrapping around me like a second skin. I knew the tower was waiting, and it was growing impatient. I climbed the creaking stairs to the clock room with the journal tucked under my arm. Samuel Delaney's words had become my only source of clarity, a fragile tether to understanding the malevolent presence that permeated the tower. As I flipped through the journal's worn pages, a new entry caught my eye. It was dated just a few days before Delaney's disappearance. They watch from the gears. Always moving, always shifting. Time bends for them, and they bend for nothing. Follow the rules, and they let you stay. But break them, and they take everything. The words chilled me, their implications cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. What were they, and how had Delaney known so much? I set the journal aside and focused on my duties. The pendulum was swinging steadily, and the clock hands rested perfectly at 3:15 a.m. For now, everything was as it should be. The night unfolded with an almost oppressive calm, the kind that felt like the precursor to a storm. At 1 a.m., I followed rule number 1, closing my eyes for exactly 1 minute. The ticking of the clock filled the room, louder than usual, each second feeling like a hammer strike against my skull. When I opened my eyes, the room was as I'd left it, but a faint metallic smell lingered in the air, sharp and acrid. I didn't know where it came from, but it reminded me of blood. At 2 a.m., the shadow returned. This time, it wasn't lingering at the base of the tower, it was on the stairs. I spotted it on the monitors, a formless darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe as it ascended step by step. My heart raced as I locked the clock room door and turned off the lights, praying it wouldn't try to force its way inside. The shadow stopped just outside the door, its presence a suffocating weight that pressed against my chest. I could hear it moving, a faint scraping sound like nails dragging across stone. For a moment, I thought it would leave, but then it began to whisper. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The voice was soft and raspy, the words stretching unnaturally as if time itself was being pulled apart. I covered my ears and closed my eyes, focusing on the rhythmic ticking of the clock to drown it out. After what felt like an eternity, the whispers faded, and the shadow retreated. When I checked the monitors, it was gone, but the stairs were covered in a fine layer of ash. The next hour passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the tower's wooden beams. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the bells rang out, their chimes echoing through the empty town below. I recited rule number 6 as a precaution, even though the bells were ringing at the correct time. The air felt heavier with each chime, as if the tower itself was holding its breath. When the final note faded, I collapsed into the chair, my body trembling from the strain. But the night wasn't over. At 3:30 a.m., the pendulum stopped. I froze, my mind racing as I recalled rule number 2. Restart the pendulum immediately, but do not look at your reflection in the clock face. I approached the pendulum cautiously, my breath coming in shallow gasps. As I reached out to set it in motion, the metallic smell returned, stronger this time, almost choking me. I tried not to think about it as I gave the pendulum a gentle push, its rhythmic swing resuming instantly. I resisted the urge to look up, to see if my reflection was watching me again. Instead, I backed away slowly, refusing to let my curiosity betray me. The final test of the night came just before dawn. The shadow reappeared, larger than before, its form nearly filling the entire staircase. It didn't move this time, but its presence was suffocating, a black hole that seemed to draw in all the light around it. I stayed in the clock room, clutching Delaney's journal like a lifeline, and waited for sunrise. When the first rays of light pierced the darkness, the shadow melted away, leaving behind nothing but silence. As the sun rose, I packed my belongings, knowing I couldn't endure another night in the tower. I left a note for Mr. Adler, explaining my resignation and urging him to find someone else, someone who could handle the weight of the rules better than I could. I didn't look back as I walked away from the clock tower, the weight of its presence lifting with each step I took. But even as I drove away from Bellhaven, I couldn't shake the feeling that the tower wasn't finished with me. The sound of ticking echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that time was still watching. When I arrived home, I noticed something strange. Every clock in my apartment was set to 3:15 a.m. I reset them, but no matter what I did, they always returned to that cursed time. A week later, I received a package in the mail. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and worn. It was another set of rules, written in the same elegant handwriting. At the bottom, a note read, "Time remembers."